But ever since the fall of Adam and Eve, things have been running down and wearing out. The Bible says, for example, "In the beginning you laid the foundations of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. They will all wear out like a garment. Like clothing, you will change them, and they will be discarded. But you remain the same, and your years will never end." So which belief fits the scientific law the best? The third law that we want to discuss this evening is that information cannot rise from matter. It must come from some source of intelligence. Now this seems so obvious that it's almost foolish to mention it, that it takes information to make anything. If you want to make something, you have to know how to do it. For example, if you want to build this motor, it takes a lot of information. You have to know how it works. You have to know all the right parts and how to make those parts, and you have to know how to put those parts together. Over the years, more people become involved, and they add more intelligence and more information, and so you perfect this design and the model. Like this engine here, for example, that's a whole lot better than the engine that was put into a Model T, for example. It's been developed and perfected over the years. All of that took an incredible amount of information. Now, this law of science simply states that this information cannot come from matter, from non-living things. It has to come from a source of intelligence. It's not going to arise out of a solution of salt and water or other chemicals. It's not going to come from a rock. There has to be intelligence to produce this kind of information. That's pretty obvious. Yet here again, the evolutionists contradict the scientific facts. You know, we live in a wonderful age where we have discovered so much about the world that we live in. Scientific discovery, discovering the amazing complexity of every living organism. You know, this motor looks pretty complex, but that's nothing compared to a single cell of a living organism. A single cell in a living organism has been compared not just to a motor like this that has many hundreds of parts, but to the factory that builds those motors. Because inside this cell, it's literally a factory of different parts, different motors and engines working to build certain things that work together with this part that's building something else, and they all come together to do whatever it is that this cell needs to do for the whole body. And then it also has a whole manufacturing plant to be able to reproduce an exact copy of this cell. Something like that requires an incredible amount of information to be able to work together and to do those things. Here we have a simple diagram of a molecule of DNA. And we've learned that all the information needed to produce a living thing is contained in its DNA. It's a complete blueprint for the whole body. And there's an incredible amount of information stored there. Information for growing your hair and your arms and legs and bones and muscles and everything that's needed to make up your body is contained in the DNA. And it's been stated that if you wanted to print out all the information in one single strand of DNA, it would take a whole set of encyclopedias to contain all that information. Now, where did that information come from? Evolutionists claim that all this information arose by itself originally, that there was no source of intelligence that designed this or planned it. There was no source of intelligence that put these things together and made it work. It all just happened by itself. Whereas the Bible account of creation tells us that all this information came from a very intelligent source, from the God who knows all things. He's the one who designed all things. He's the one that made the blueprint for every living organism on earth. And He's the one that designed the DNA as the storehouse for that information. And then also produced the RNA to be able to copy that information for every living thing. Now, another problem for evolutionists when it comes to this matter of information is that they suggest that the ongoing evolution of all living things from that first initial living organism, that one-celled organism, into all the living things that we have today, including man, that involved and required an incredible amount of new information being added to that original cell. And so again, where did that new information come from? The evolutionist says that there was no intelligence involved here, that it just simply happened by itself. For example, here is a typical diagram of the evolutionary process, or at least one small part of that process. Where does the information come from for Osteolepis to grow legs and lungs and to crawl out on land, as they claim it did? And then from there, it developed, one line developed into reptiles, snakes and lizards and alligators and so on. Another line developed into amphibians, salamanders and frogs. Where does all this new information come from? Think about it, just for these fins of the fish to develop into legs, you have to have new bones. The bones have to completely change their formation. Fish bones are soft and flexible. Bones of reptiles are hard like our own. The only suggestion or explanation that evolutionists can come up with for all this added information is mutations and natural selection. But we need to understand a few things about mutations and natural selection. Mutations are a corruption of information. They're copying mistakes. Mutations produce this cat with two faces. Mutations cause all the cancers that we know in our body. This is an example of skin cancer. Mutations cause birth defects, like a hair lip or cleft palate. So these mutations are all mistakes. And scientists have yet to find any mutation that increases the genetic information in such a way that's needed for the evolutionary process, for this fish, for example, to grow legs. Even those few examples of mutations that they claim have a beneficial effect, like, for example, the superbugs that become immune to antibiotics, that's caused by a mutation. And it's really pretty remarkable what happens. They're able to survive in a surrounding of antibiotics, which normally would kill that cell. They're able to survive, but as a result, their natural defenses have been weakened so that they do not survive as well in a natural environment. Not only that, but the mutations that we see involve very small changes and corruptions in the information that are in the DNA. And so even if it were possible to have a corruption of information that resulted in a beneficial gain of information, even if that were possible, it would take literally millions of these mutations all happening at the same time, all working together for the same purpose in order for this fin now to grow into a leg or to grow lungs. It wouldn't do any good for just part of this information to come about at a time. A fish with half a leg is not going to be able to survive either on land or in the water. It all has to come together. It has to work together at the same time. And if there's no intelligence involved here to add that information, there's no way that these mutations can explain such a change. So the other solution that scientists come up with to explain this added information is natural selection. But we need to understand that natural selection only varies the information that's already there. It doesn't add any new information. Natural selection is what explains why there's so much variety within a species, like the variations between dogs and the variations among flowers, or Darwin's famous finches. Darwin claims that the variation in these finches that he observed was an evidence of how evolution happens. He looked at the different finches. He saw that the different finches in different areas had different shapes and sizes of beaks, and they were more suitable for different types of food that were available in their area. But it's simply an example of the variation within a species. Every type of animal and plant has enough genetic information already in it to have this wide variety. These finches all have the genetic information that's needed for all of those kinds of beaks. And so natural selection simply isolates a certain genetic information for a certain beak that is suitable for a certain food source. And so finches that find themselves in an area where there's a lot of seeds and not many insects, those finches that have the stronger beaks are going to thrive there. And so they're going to reproduce more, and finally you find a population of finches that all has the strong, stout beak for eating seeds. But that's not a gain of information. They've actually lost some of the information for the other types of beaks. That natural selection doesn't change a species or give any new information that it would allow a species to change into another type of animal or for a fish to grow legs. And of course the Bible agrees perfectly with what we see in the world. Then God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb that yields seed, and the fruit tree that yields fruit according to its kind, whose seed is in itself on the earth." And it was so. So the earth brought forth grass, the herb that yields seed according to its kind, and the tree that yields fruit whose seed is in itself according to its kind. And God made the beast of the earth according to its kind, cattle according to its kind, and everything that creeps on the earth according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. So the Bible account of creation says that God created every living being and every living thing to reproduce according to its kind. So a dog is always going to be a dog. Now, there's a wide variety of variation within the species of dog, isn't there? But this little Chihuahua has lost the information that's needed for it to grow into a big Great Dane. So it's not a gain of information that causes this variation. It's actually a narrowing down of the information that's available in the species. So again, natural selection cannot account for the mass evolution from microbes to man. All right, the fourth and final law of science that's universally accepted is that order cannot come from disorder. And this points out just another angle of the problem with evolution. And we need to clarify one thing first, and that is that there's a difference between random order and meaningful order. The evolutionists will claim, when we talk about how there's so much order in the universe, they'll say, well, that's just the way it turned out. It doesn't prove that there's any intelligence behind it. It's just when things came together, that's the order that they fell into. If it would happen again, it would no doubt turn out in a different way. But we want to think about this a little bit and see, is that really a legitimate explanation for what we observe in the world? There is a difference between random order and meaningful order. For example, you can drop a handful of sticks on a table, and there's going to be a certain order there. It can be interesting and even beautiful, but it has no meaningful purpose. It's just random. It will be different every time. We can see that type of random order in nature.